Hola YouTube, estamos en el cuarto de estar en Granada. My name is Nye from Folk Friend, your one-stop shop for Celtic backing guitar tutorials. I had a request recently from somebody called Edward who said, can you please tell us about 5/1s comping techniques, turnarounds, and lots of jazz words. And I said, jazz? We can't have jazz here, this is a folk music channel. No, I didn't really. Anybody who knows me will know my first love is jazz, and I use loads of jazz chords because they're cool as. So yeah, this is like a little tips and tricks video in which I'm only going to talk about 5/1s at the ends of sections, and I'm just going to show you some different chord shapes you can use. What I've done, because I haven't got access to my usual snazzy editing computer, I can't do the little chord overlays that I would normally do. What I've done instead is I've made a blog, which you can find in the link down below, which has just got lots of chord diagrams for all of these that I'm about to show you. So, the first thing, 5/1s for major keys. I'm going to use G major as an example to begin with. So, in G major, your 5 back to 1 is D back to G at the ends of sections. So, you'd be going something like that. The first thing you can do, chord 5s, you can always make them into dominant chords. So level 1 is D7 back to G. More interesting than that, you can add any numbers to those dominant chords that you want. So here is, if I make my 5 chord D into D9 instead of D7, it sounds like this. I really like that one, I use that a lot. You can find a diagram for D7 on the blog in the link down below. One thing to note about that D9 chord that I just played, there's this little triangle shape also in the blog down below, and this triangle is mega useful. If you've got this triangle with your middle finger on the 5th fret of the A string, index on the 4th of the D string, and ring finger on the 5th of the G string, that is the notes of a D7 chord. You've got your root there, you've got your 3rd under your index finger, and your flattened 7th under your ring finger. You can then add your little finger in all sorts of other places to get different variants of a D dominant chord, a D7 chord. So if it's there on the 5th fret of the B string, then it's D9. If you want to give your 5/1 there a sort of extra jazzy flavour, move that little finger up a fret, so you've got D sharp 9. You'll get a kind of extra tense version of that chord, otherwise known as the Hendrix chord as well. So if you go back to G from that, that's really nice. Like that. Another thing you can do, using that same little triangle, flatten your index finger so it's barring, it's still holding down the D string, but it's also flattened to be holding down the B string as well. Try not to fret the E string with it, but if you do, it doesn't matter too much. Then you've got a D flat 9 chord, which is another extra tense chord you can use for 5/1s. So that's a nice option as well. Other sorts of jazzy chords, for our D chord, we could have D13, that's a nice one. That's something like this. So you make a bar across the 5th fret, you put your, you make something that looks very much like an A7 shape. So this is basically a D7 bar chord, but deliberately with the wrong fingers. So I've got my middle finger on the 7th fret of the D string, and my ring finger on the 7th fret of the B string. Then I'm going to add my little finger so that it's fretting the 13th note, the 6th, that's another, the 6th and the 13th are the same thing. If you want to know more about the chord construction, there's a blog about that as well, which I wrote some time ago, which will make this a lot clearer for you. That's also linked in the box down below. Anyway, my little finger's on the 7th fret, and you get lovely chord there. And you can go back to your D chord from that. I must say I don't really use that one for folk just because it's too slow to get to, but it's pretty cool. There's an easier way of playing D13, but it's all the way up here, so it's like a D7 bar chord with your index finger barring across the 10th fret. Then you make a shape like an E7, like that. Then you put your little finger on the 12th fret of the B string. That's the exact same chord as that one. It's just another way of playing it. I haven't mentioned 11 chords, and that's because I don't really use them, I don't really like them. That's it, it's purely personal prejudice. Yes, anyway, moving swiftly on. The other 5-1 I really love for major keys is something that I call the disco chord, because it's in about 1 million disco hits, and I've devoted a whole section of my book, Backing Guitar Techniques for Traditional Celtic Music, to the disco chord because it's great. So what it is the notes of chord 4, which is a C major chord. So if I make a C major bar chord, you can probably see this more clearly. There's a C major bar chord, and from that I'm going to take those 3. So that's C, E and G, the notes of a C major chord. But then instead of having C as my root note, I'm going to change that root note and move it up 2 frets so that my root note is the 5th note of the scale, but over it I've got the notes of a chord 4. And that gives you this really cool kind of, it feels like it's kind of waiting for something, but then you can resolve it back to chord 1, and there it is. I really love this chord and I use it all the time for various different purposes, but one of the main ones you can use it for is 5-1s in major keys. Another thing you can do with the disco chord is if you flatten the index finger in it so that it's fretting both the B and the E strings, and then move that index finger down a fret, you get that one, which is really nice. And then if you want to make it extra tense, move your middle finger down 1 fret as well. You get that delightfully miserable chord, and then you can resolve that back to chord 1 and everything's fine again. So all together you've got disco chord, index finger back 1, and then middle finger back 1, and then back to G. So yeah, those 3 chords pretty handy for 5-1s in major keys. Now let's have a look at the other types of tune. There are 3 other modes available to us: Dorian, Aeolian and Mixolydian. For the 2 minor ones, Dorian and Aeolian, you can swap chord 5 to a minor 7 to make it more interesting. So let's take an example in A Dorian, for example. That's an easy one to do. So your main chords A major, D major, E minor, and you're going to be going from E minor chord 5 back to A minor chord 1. So instead of E minor, level 1 is make it more interesting by removing the ring finger. That gives you E minor 7, and then you can go back to A minor from that. You can make A minor 7 as well if you want it to be jazzier. So that's quite nice. With the E minor 7, if you add the little finger there as an optional extra, it makes it a bit more 7-y. That's quite nice too. A sort of jazz trick is that anytime you've got a chord which resolves down a 5th, so a 5-1 in other words, you can convert the chord 5 to a dominant chord, even if it started out as a minor chord. And this trick sort of can be used in folky contexts. It's not a sort of standard thing to do, but it sounds pretty cool. So with our 5-1 in the key of A minor, A Dorian, I'm going to swap my E minor chord to an E7 chord, and that'll make it want to resolve even more back to A minor. So that means that I can use any of those shapes that I used in the previous example, apart from the disco chord, but any of the dominant chord shapes, so like 9 or 13, or altered dominants like the sharp 9 and the flat 9 that I showed you before, I can use them in place of my chord 5. So if we're in A Dorian, E is there, that's E9. So it's the same as the D9 we used before, but just shifted up 2 frets. And now you can keep the open strings at the top and bottom in it because they're E strings, so obviously they're going to fit with an E chord. And I can use that for a 5-1 in a minor key. I will caveat that by saying that you have to be a bit sparing with these. They don't always sound good. They're an option. Sometimes they sound cool, other times they sound a bit terrible. So just be a bit careful with them, but mess around, trust your ears. Likewise, we can do the Hendrix chord, otherwise known as the sharp 9. So E sharp 9 back to A minor, sounds cool. The same E flat 9, really nice, very kind of tango-y. Yeah. That applies for both Aeolian and Dorian. Let's take another minor key example. Let's talk about E Dorian. So all those same shapes, you just transpose them for this. So if I'm in E, my 5-1's going to be B minor back to E minor. Now I'm going to use either B9, that's quite cool. Even better, either B sharp 9 or B flat 9. All good options. Finally, Mixolydian. If you're in a Mixolydian mode, your 1 chord is dominant, and that's because Mixolydian is the 5th mode, so compared to a major scale it starts on the 5th chord, which is a dominant chord once you start adding in more jazzy chords. You can see that on the amazing mode wheel, by the way, a very useful invention if I do say so myself. So let's take an example in D Mixolydian. Squizzle that round, there we go. There's our D7 chord, that's going to be our 1 chord, and our 5 chord, which we're going to resolve to it from, is A minor. So A minor back to D7. So for the A minor there, you can use any kind of minor 7 with any numbers that you want. So let's take A minor back to D7, that's going to be our 1 chord. So quite nice. We can add, with the A minor there for example, we could add the index finger on the 2nd fret of the E string. That would give us an A minor 13 chord. And then when it resolves back to D7, sounds pretty nice. That's probably an even nicer option if you add your little finger on the 3rd fret there. That's just another flat 7th for your chord, but it resolves nicely down to the F sharp at the top of the D chord there. So that's a really nice one if you're in D Mixolydian. A thing I really like to do in the key of D Mixolydian is, this is very kind of non-standard, but if you use D9 as your root chord in D Mixolydian, then you've got that classic like James Brown kind of sound. Anyway, and then you can use this shape, which is an A minor 7, but it avoids the need to do the bar, which takes quite a long time to get to. And from a D9 chord, you can really easily just switch between those two like that. So you go from your D9 chord there. Again, obviously you probably can't see my fingers too well, but check out the blog down below, it's got diagrams. Then you move your middle finger up one string, and you move your index finger to the 5th fret of the bottom string, and that gives you a nice A minor 7. You can leave the top string open, ringing out in it as well. That sounds pretty good. So yeah, I've blasted through loads of shapes there without talking too much about how you actually use them or the theory, but experiment with them. I mean, they're all good for 5/1s, how I've said, but they're also all good for other things. Anytime in a folk tune you've got a chord which is resolving down a 5th, so like, let's say you've got a tune in the key of G major, and at some point you're going to play a chord progression that goes from A minor to D, then you can put a dominant in the place of the first chord, and you can use any of those shapes that I've just mentioned. Just move them to the right place on the neck so that their root note, the lowest note in the chord, is on the correct note for the one that you want. And then you can use them. So in the case of that example I was just on about, A minor to D, you could play A9, for example, going to D9, and then it will want to come back to G at the end. So that's basically a 2-5-1 in the key of G major, which is a really nice way to end things and make them sound really jazzy. Anyway, that's it for this one. I hope you've got something out of this. Thank you to Edward for the suggestion. If you've got any more suggestions, keep them coming in. I'm always happy to make videos about anything people want to know about. If you want to know loads more about this and properly understand the theory in a hurry, then my book is the place to start. Backing Guitar Techniques for Traditional Celtic Music. It's linked at the end of the video. And also, the mode wheel is a really useful tool. I'm really pleased with these, and they're absolutely flying off the shelves at the moment. I've had some really good feedback about them. So yeah, check them out as well. They are on the shop page of my website, which is in the box down below. Yeah, that's about it for this week. Hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell next to it. You'll be notified when I make new videos. I make at least one video every week. Yeah, thanks very much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.